Oh, hey,
Hello,
hi,
hello.
hello.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am still in London for a short while longer. So yes, and calling Rick Byer in Chicago.
Here I am, and here I'll stay for a bit,
Really, good for you.
at least for a few weeks. I think I might have a show or two on the road, but not too much before Normandy in April. Hey, everybody! Welcome to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. You can check it out at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the podcast.
Ooh, that's your podcast. That your podcast voice?
Yeah, thank
Oh,
you
I
for
like it.
joining us. And today we are covering 500 years of German military history. I don't know what we're going to fill the rest of the hour with, Chris, but we'll do what we can. Let us know you're here and what you're drinking. And Chris, we should shout out to our Patreon
We should.
supporters.
As always, we're deeply thank you for our top shelf patrons and all of our patrons for making this all possible.
Yes, thank you very much.
Seriously, if you didn't do it, we wouldn't be here. So we do
Yes,
thank you.
and that enables the huge salaries that we're somehow failing to pay ourselves. But we appreciate it anyway. Patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Chris, who's out there? It looks like we got a good audience already.
Yeah, we have Doreen, Gene Templin. Xavier's joined us from Spain, so we have our international
Nice.
audience.
All right.
Nancy Nylens is here, and Frank Cook.
Ken from
So,
Kansas, Carla
yeah,
from Oklahoma,
yeah.
Laurel from Portland, Maine. It's a veritable geographical smorgasbord.
Ooh,
So I know that's the longest word I'm going to try in the show today. So do you think we're ready to go? Do you think we can get
I think
started?
so. All right, here we go.
All right, I have to take the top shelf thing off
All
the yeah.
right.
Whoops.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and our guest today, who's joining us, Peter Wilson, is the Chichely Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford, a title which neither Chris nor I will ever hold. Uh, he's president of the Society for the History of War and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's the author of a new book, one in a long line of books he's written. This one's entitled Iron and Blood, A Military History of the German-Speaking Peoples Since 1500. So, Peter Wilson, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me.
We're delighted to have you. Did you bring a cocktail? That's what everyone will want to know.
Well, I thought I'd bring something appropriate. So, German beer in a proper German glass from Stuttgart.
Oh, from
All
Stuttgart,
right.
my old one-time hometown. There you go.
Oh,
So there you go.
that coddling town. Yeah.
Chris, what have you got?
I have a gin.
A gin, just
Right now.
nice.
Hold up
I'm,
the side.
I'm
And
going
you?
with a generic beer. Generic. I could call it German, but let's say it's a Blue Moon, so it's not really
Oh,
German
okay.
beer. Peter, thank you again for joining us. The title of your book is taken from a speech that Otto von Bismarck gave in the Prussian Diet shortly before taking office as President Minister of Prussia in 1862. And I'm shortening it slightly, but he says, "Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by iron and blood." So there's a view slash myth slash stereotype, whatever, that Germany is a uniquely militaristic nation, and that quote is sometimes used kind of in support of that. What does that idea get right? What does it get wrong? And what is your point of view that you're putting forth in your new book?
Right. Well, I think it gets some of it right, and I'm certainly not here just to say that the received view is all wrong, but it does. The received view, I think, oversimplifies things, and it suggests that there is a kind of continuous line of development, and that development is associated with Prussia, because Prussia becomes a dominant state by the end of the 19th century, and I wanted to sort of vary that to look at to understand that this is a bigger story. It's a more complicated story. It takes in broader, what we might call the German political space in the heart of Europe. And it's definitely not predetermined that Germany will emerge the way that it does. That's a result of partly of victories and defeats on the battlefield, partly through various other factors, and it is not a story that should be defined by what we know about the two world wars and just then read backwards in a kind of origin story.
So Peter, I think since you do this so well in the book, maybe you can help the viewers understand how you define German-speaking peoples. It's because as you sort of alludes to, we just immediately think Prussians, spiked helmets, but it's much broader than that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the modern boundaries of Germany, or even the boundaries of Germany in the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, they don't make sense if we look back. You only need to open a historical atlas to see that this was a part of Europe that changed shape and changed composition a lot over the centuries, and that itself needs an explanation. So Prussia, for example, is no longer part of Germany. It's split between Poland and Russia. It contained a substantial minority of non-German speakers in 1914. The situation is very, very complicated. But broadly speaking, what I'm looking at is the stories, the military history of what we would now call Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and also those parts that belonged to the German political space, if you like, the sort of Central Europe. So that would include what would now be, say, the Czech Republic, for instance, and parts of northern Italy at different times.
So, Peter, you could have gone back 2,000 years. You could have, then of course the book would be this big, but you could have gone back 2,000 years and started with Arminius in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Varus, where are my legions? You could have started with the rise of Prussia, started with Frederick the Great, started with the 30 Years' War. I'm just showing that I've read the table of contents. Why did you choose 1500 as a starting point?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do that for a number of reasons. One, because one of my arguments is that our sort of classic understanding is that this is all about highly centralized power state that uses military power for aggressive purposes, to fight offensive wars, and that is part of the story. That's certainly part of Prussia's story, but it's not the dominant theme throughout certainly the last 500 years. So much of this is decentralized. It's about collective security. It's about reacting to external threats. And I wanted to, so I take that back to the point where we can understand where that comes from, and that comes from the Holy Roman Empire, which is something I have actually written a book that does go back 1,000 years, covers that story, that political story. But it's in a system that is complicated. It has multiple warlords. How do they stop fighting each other? How do they cooperate against serious external threats, such as the Ottoman Turks? And that's emerging around that period, around 1500. And it's also a period when warfare is changing. So this is the era when gunpowder weaponry, mass infantry tactics, and so on becomes the dominant form, and will certainly shape much of military organization and warfare for a good period beyond that.
So, Peter, I always like it when guests kind of lead me into my next question, so I really want to thank you for that. But I think it's really important. Could you kind of describe what you mean by the Holy Roman Empire? What was it, and what part does it play in this development of a German military story? Because, I mean, again, you said like a lot of people focus on the wars of the 20th century, but a good portion of the beginning of your book is about this Holy Roman Empire. So people need to understand what that is.
And I always heard that the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, wasn't Roman.
Yeah, dropping the cliche. Yeah,
like if there's a cliche to go, I've got it.
Well, it's actually all three. But we'll probably need many hours to talk about that. I mean, put simply, it's best to understand it as a kind of political hierarchy where power is shared. So it's headed by an emperor who was, at that point, it was elected, who held the initiative, and by that point is held by the Austrian Habsburg family that directly owned around a third of the physical space of the empire, and therefore that enables them to have that monopoly. But they can't act in the name of the whole empire without the consent of the leading princes and the larger cities and so on that make up the rest of the space and the rest of the powers. And so they evolve various institutions that allow them to take collective decisions, and in particular, to have a stake in those decisions, you also had responsibilities, and that was to contribute men and money for internal peacekeeping and external defense.
So the Holy Roman Empire is sometimes, I guess it's the Habsburgs are running that empire for not all of it, but for a big chunk of it and a big chunk of the time period in your book. And you kind of have said, hey, everybody's looking at the Prussians, but we should really be looking at the Habsburgs too.
Yeah.
Is there tell us a little bit more about them, and is there a contrast between a Habsburg way of war and the Prussian way of war that we come to think of, perhaps, that develops?
Yeah, well, I think first of all there is something which I would say comes to be understood as the German way of war, and that does have roots in Prussia, and that is something that emerges sort of in the 18th century. It's associated definitely with Frederick the Great, and it is definitely there from after the victory over France in 1870-71, because the Germans begin to believe this, and outside observers believe this. So that is the idea that you have first strike capacity. You know, you're surrounded by hostile powers. You have to maintain first strike capacity. You have to fight quickly and decisively, otherwise you'll get overwhelmed in a war of attrition. And the thing is, this model which is hugely seductive because it promises the chance of a quick and relatively inexpensive in terms of blood and treasure in an inexpensive victory. So it's hugely seductive, and the spectacular successes that Prussia has, and also with its German allies, we shouldn't forget, in 1866 over Austria and in 1870 over France, convinces people that they've somehow unlocked the secrets of military success, because in both of those wars they were not necessarily predicted to win, and they come to believe this themselves. And of course, this is the model that they're fighting on with in the two world wars, and it goes disastrously wrong in both those occasions. So there is that, and I'm not saying that there doesn't exist, but we can't read the whole story through that. And if we look at who is the aggressor in the 16th, the 17th, and even into the 18th century that comes from this part of Europe, it's not Prussia. It's the Austrian Habsburgs, because they consistently have the largest army, and they're also the best organized most of the time, and they are the model that other people are copying. And even into the early 19th century, they are still seen as the leading military power. It's only really after 1866 that the attention decisively shifts to Prussia, and people think, well, we'll copy the Prussian model, and that becomes the image of Germany, because of course Prussia has created a second German empire by breaking up the German Confederation, which was the kind of reconstituted Holy Roman Empire, if you like, after the Napoleonic Wars.
So Peter, but could you maybe talk a little bit about how, if you look at Prussia, some pretty inauspicious beginnings, and if you were to look at all of the German states, say at the start of the 18th century, you maybe wouldn't have picked them out.
Yeah.
But maybe just talk a little bit about how they begin their rise, and what are all the other German states doing as this is happening?
Yeah. Well, we've got to remember that a lot of the historical writing that we're influenced by comes from the German tradition in the later 19th century. This is, if you think of Ranke and the sort of development of professional history and so forth, and these were people who chronicled the rise of Prussia, and it's a kind of great story. Seemingly comes from the the sandbox of the empire, it was called, because the soil is supposedly so unfertile, and so from this unpromising beginnings, emerges as this great power, and that of course makes a very powerful story. But they actually had a number of assets. They accumulated by the middle of the 17th century the sort of the second largest territorial bloc. So they already have about within the empire nearly 15% or so compared to the Habsburgs 30%. And they controlled Prussia, which was not really part of the empire. It had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they managed through very successful switching sides in a conflict, that one of the northern wars that was about the domination of the Baltic. They secured sovereignty for Prussia, which gave them something which none of the other German princes had, which was sovereign territory, which got them recognized. And then their success after that is by belonging to alliances and getting something out of those alliances. And the royal title, which Frederick the Great always mocked and said wasn't really worth the money and all of this, does get them noticed. They in the peace settlements that end the War of Spanish Succession, the Prussians are there. They get their royal title recognized. They are recognized as an independent sovereign power that is part of the sort of concert of Europe, if you like. Whereas the other princes, like the Duke of Lorraine, is sort of politely shown the door. No, you can't join these discussions. And so it has real weight, and they get into this sort of, they creep up into this sort of first tier of European states by utilizing their military resources, but also by skillful diplomacy.
I guess one of the things that's always confused me a little bit is why the Habsburgs, why that whole empire that falls apart, right? I mean, as you say, they kind of they're there first in a way. They're more powerful first. They are powerful up until really the early 20th century, although it's diminishing at that point. What happens? So you talked a little bit about the advantages that Prussia has as they expand and become more powerful. What happens to the Habsburgs, and why do they become the has-beens,
Yes.
essentially?
Well, they're by the advantage of having so many territories. Of course, you have lots of resources, and they acquire these territories. So the classic thing is, oh, lucky Austria, where others make war, you marry. So the idea that they accumulate their territories peacefully, actually they always have to fight to secure these inheritances. None of them are without conflict, and they acquire these lands. That gives them this great potential. They are the leading family of Europe, and the imperial title. Remember, there's no other emperor at this point, so they have this. They're in the pinnacle, and they're seen as this, and they're always the French always challenging them. So they have that advantage, but of course that also is a geographic spread, and you have more security concerns and threats and so forth. And they balance that out by the fact that they have access to the German resources. So because they can reward the German princes with various non-monetary concessions, which mattered to the princes, so new titles and influence and so forth, they got additional soldiers that helped them out. And part of the decline of the Habsburgs is when they can no longer do that. When the old Holy Roman Empire goes, a lot of the mechanisms that they had to mobilize these additional German resources disappear, and they are then much more fall back on their own resources, and the disparity grows obviously in the later 19th century. So there are lots of explanations that we can cite, but slower rate of industrialization, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and so forth mean that they're constantly slipping down. But they are still, as you say, they're still recognized as a major power. They're actually the seventh. They had the seventh largest navy in the world in 1914, which is something that we tend not to think about. It was bigger than the Russian navy because, of course, that had suffered so many losses in the Russo-Japanese War. And so they had assets, but they picked the wrong side.
Oh, but one of the things, one of the figures that looms large in this story, obviously, is Frederick II or Frederick the Great, and you say that he's being viewed as the archetypical German militarist. Which and this is what I love. You go on to say, which is kind of ironic considering his greatest influence was France.
Yeah.
So could you maybe talk about a little bit about his place in the story and kind of the truth versus the reality
Yeah.
of that story?
Yes. Well, I mean, he's as you say, he becomes revered as this sort of figure, and it's no surprise that in the lead up to the First World War, the German General Staff historical section devotes its main energies to chronicling the campaigns of Frederick the Great. And the First World War is sort of interpreted partly through the understanding of the 7 Years' War. Was it right for Frederick the Great to start the 7 Years' War in Europe with a first strike? That was the same. People were thinking, well, was it right to invade Belgium? And of course, it's Frederick's portrait that hangs over Hitler's desk in the bunker. So yeah, he has this kind of iconic presence, but he was a complicated character, and we have to remember that yes, he starts conflicts. He starts the War of Austrian Succession, and he starts the 7 Years' War. But very quickly, he has allies, and without those allies, Prussia would have been very, very rapidly defeated. And he almost goes under, of course, in the 7 Years' War. And there are multiple occasions where he narrowly escapes death in battle or even capture, and the story would have been very, very different. It would have been like Charles XII of Sweden, who gets shot by probably one of his own soldiers in 1718, and that's the end of the Swedish Empire.
So does he deserve the title Great? Or should we start lucky?
Well, yeah, you could say. I mean, these are, it's interesting. I mean, in the 18th century, people talked sometimes about Louis XIV as Louis the Great. So there are these other figures that feature. He was a very sophisticated and skillful self-promoter. This is not to diminish the things that he did achieve, but he fashioned his own image, and that image suited certain agendas after his death too.
Very diplomatically put.
That's a non-denial denial. We'll acknowledge that and move on. So I'd like to go back in time a little bit because one of the things that I was kind of interested in the discussion about is something we don't think about a lot, is the development of professional armies. And the ironic thing a little bit here is we talk about the German way of war, which might be the rigid centralized army, but of course there is no Germany in 1500. There's all these principalities that are loosely confederated, many of them in the Holy Roman Empire. But talk a little bit about when sort of professional armies develop, and are the German-speaking peoples, are they ahead of England, France, Spain? Are they behind? And kind of when does that happen, and why does it happen?
Right. It's a long process. I suppose when we're talking about armies, we're really talking about sort of institutions, and warfare is largely seasonal into the early 17th century. So the first permanent armies are maintained in peace as well as war, but also maintained in the winter months of a long-running war, rather than just in the campaign season in the spring and the summer. So it was quite common in the early 16th century to basically disband. You just leave a few garrisons, you've captured some territory, you can't afford the troops, they march home, you re-recruit them, they turn it up again. And this is because it's also war in an age of grass. Grass is your fuel for all the cavalry horses, all the pack horses and everything that tows all your wagons and so on. So it was very difficult to operate in the winter months. So you save money, and so you have the seasonal character of warfare, and that gradually dissipates. So the Austrians create a permanent defensive system because you can't have peace with the Turks. So all the conflicts with the Turks only end with a truce before the end of the 17th century. So they have to maintain garrisons and so on because there's always raiding going on. And it's really by the later 17th century where it becomes the idea that you maintain a cadre of professionals, so officers and long-serving soldiers, which you flesh out in wartime. So that's, you have this mobilization system, so you recruit additional soldiers, and that remains the system really across the 18th century. And then in the early 19th century, we move over to cohort conscription, where men are inducted, serve a period, return to peacetime civilian life, but have obligations in the reserve.
Chris, can I follow that with a question?
Yes, you may.
That's okay. So we had on historian Frederica Baer on the show recently, and she wrote the book Hessians. She's done a lot of tremendous research in that area. There was one thing, I mean, there's two different points I can raise. You can address one or both, or neither, I suppose, is also an option. But one is that she talked about the fact that of the number of states that that offered troops to Britain, that Prussia, oddly, was the one that didn't, and wasn't happy that the other people were doing so. But the thing that I noticed in your book is you talk about this idea of hiring out troops for these German states is old, far older than the Hessians in the American Revolution. That this was a long-standing tradition with the Swiss and some of the other German principalities. So, can you just talk a little bit about that history?
Yes, that's right. I mean, we also have in European history, there's obviously the Irish, the wild geese and so on, who serve France and so on. But the majority of these foreign soldiers who serve, and they serve initially just for a campaign, and they go home, and they come, then you create permanent regiments. So the French are in the sort of mid to late 16th century are creating semi-permanent regiments of Swiss and Germans, mainly. Sometimes they have Italians as well, but the majority come from Switzerland and Germany. And we're talking sort of probably about 3-4 million men overall across the sort of 16th through into the 18th century. And yeah, this was particularly for the Swiss, it seems to be a kind of rite of passage for a lot of young men. You go off, you try to make your fortune, you come back with hopefully a bag of money, and then you could perhaps inherit the farm and settle down. So this was very, very, very common, in fact. Yeah.
So, Pippi, one of the things I'd love to get your opinion on is, when did these various German states, principalities, cities, free states, all this melange of things, when do they start to say, "Wait a minute, we're Germans"? And not only, in a political sense, but also in a military sense, because I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, that's tricky. There is, I think that the best answer is that there is a sense of German as politics. So you get a lot of writers in the later 18th century who are saying, Germany, or meaning the empire, is governed the German way, and there's a geographical description, for example, by somebody called Busching, who writes about Central Europe, and he says Slovenian is the third national language of Germany. I mean, they don't have this kind of blood and soil linguistic idea of nationalism. And that's why people like Herder are so annoyed. They think, we should have this culture, and it should be a uniform, common culture. And there have been a number of attempts, even in the 17th century, to create that, to standardize spelling, to eradicate dialects, to create a kind of common culture. So there is a cultural nationalism as well, but that's by and large muted. It's much more that we have a sense of freedom. Our identity is multi-layered, so we identify primarily with our hometown, and then maybe the principality that is part of, and then a region, and then the empire. And it's the empire that guarantees our distinctiveness. So our hometown has special privileges that isn't shared by the people down the road, and that makes us different, and there are freedoms. And that was really very much, people were very, very happy with that, by and large, with that idea. but some others were not. That is why you have this kind of cultural nationalism, and there's a lot of excellent research done on even in the later 19th century that this people like the regional identity, and there's a lot of unhappiness about being included in Bismarck's empire and the idea that we are no longer Württembergers, we are supposed to be Germans. That's not right.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we are talking today to Peter Wilson, who is the author of Iron and Blood, a military history of the German-speaking people since 1500. And Peter, we have some questions from the audience. I think we should try to bring in some of those. And I want to first ask this one from Skip Cornett. To what extent did the Protestant-Catholic conflict influence these developments? The 30 Years' War was settled, but were the sentiments and alignments still present?
Oh, yes, definitely. And the different Germanies have had different religious characters. So you can tell that today. The fact that East Germany, sort of the post Second World War East Germany, was predominantly Protestant, whereas West Germany had most of the Catholic areas, and that it very much influences sentiment and attitudes today. So that's always been there, and those configurations, of course, have changed with the shifting balance between the different confessions. But religious confession is a major part of the broader political story of Germany, definitely.
And do you want to do another question, Chris?
Yeah, let's do Lynns question.
All right, why don't you bring that up?
All right, there we go. Whoop, there we go. So Lynn wants to know, what effect, if any, did the various revolutions in the 19th century have on Prussian development? And I would tack on to that, maybe focus a bit on the French Revolution and then the subsequent wars of Napoleon, because I think that comes up quite a bit in your book.
Well, if we take the Revolutionary Wars, they basically bankrupt Prussia, and it shows the fragility of 18th century Prussia. So Prussia, by 1795, having sort of egged the Habsburgs on to fight the French, is basically bankrupt. And one of the reasons for that is that they're facing an insurrection in the Polish territories that they've just annexed. So they're confronted with a two-front war. So they pull out. And this is really one of the major reasons why the French are then subsequently successful, because the Prussians pull out. They take the whole of northern Germany into neutrality. That splits the empire, and the Austrians are left fighting more or less on their own. And then the Prussians wake up and think, hang on a minute, that's not good. The French are beginning to reorganize Germany, so they make the mistake really of fighting in 1806, and they are totally crushed. And the state is on the brink of extinction. At one point, it's so bankrupt that they think they'll sell Silesia to the French, because that's the only way they can clear the enormous reparations debt. So they're haunted by this, and this is one of the things that does influence military thinking afterwards. It's the sort of, how do we deal with the potential of the nation in arms that revolutionary France seems to represent. And there's sort of 25 million Frenchmen, and there's only about 5 million Prussians or so at that point. How do we deal with that? So that is one of the things. And then there's also the fear of revolution itself and the upheavals, because to sort out and try to reform the state creates this sort of tension between conservatives, who their old order obviously doesn't work, but they don't want to give ground socially and economically, and liberals who are trying to sort of reform things, but at the same time not to go too far towards revolution. So the spectre of revolution is there, obviously, in 1848, which sees quite a lot of fighting, in fact. And the spectre of the nation in arms is there because of 1870-71, where the French have been defeated. So the opening stages of the Franco Prussian War, or better, the Franco-German War, the Prussians have won. They've captured Napoleon III. They've captured most of the regular army. The French should give up. That's what you do. But somehow, the French have a republican movement, and they mobilize the population, and they don't give up. And this fear that victory will be snatched away from them. They've fought fair, and somehow they're going to be cheated of their success. Again, is a major thing that influences their sort of military thinking in the sort of 40 years before the First World War.
Chris, I've taken a couple of turns from you. Do you want to?
No, well, I just
Do you want your place back?
Okay, so now we've reached the point. We've been talking about the Franco Prussian War. Are there any German states as Prussia is kind of advancing forward that are saying, "Hey, wait a minute"? I think quite a bit about like Bavaria, which major player in German politics and the European scene for most of certainly up to the 18th, 19th century, and all those German states that were part of the Rhine Bund that quite happily fought with Napoleon. Mm-hmm. Are any of these other German states saying, "Hey, wait a minute, we're not really sure that we want to be part of this," or why is it always Prussia? Well, I guess I want to get at when like these other principalities kind of fade from the scene or get on board with.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there's about to, after the reorganization of the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the Napoleonic era, there is the German Confederation, which is sort of reconstituted, but with far fewer elements. So there's Austria still big, Prussia, and there's about 33 or so other German territories. And in 1866, when the Prussians have engineered a showdown with the Austrians, I think there's about 6 of those small states back the Prussians, and everyone else backs the Austrians, including Bavaria, Saxony, Hanover. Right. And some of these have quite respectable armies. I mean, the Hanoverians actually defeat a small Prussian army at the beginning of the War of 1866, and the Saxons are probably arguably the best of all the German troops. I mean, they have the best of what the Austrians were doing, but also the best of what the Prussians were doing. They sort of synthesized it. So they were really very effective, but they're on the losing side. And part of that is because the South German states take far too long to mobilize, and the Austrians are overwhelmed before that happens. And we shouldn't forget that war also sees the Italians fighting on the Prussian side. So there's a separate conflict in Italy, which the Austrians have actually won, but they're defeated by the Prussians. So it's a pretty near-run thing. And South German states are not really happy with the outcome, but they are sort of gradually sucked into, in the next 4-5 years, into what becomes the Second German Empire.
So we have a fair number of viewers who are probably have a strong interest in World War II and World War I history. And for some people, throw in Hessians, and maybe that's mainly what they know about German military history. So I guess I would say, sort of a broad question to attack this, how does the study of the hundreds of years that come before that inform our understanding of what happens in the 20th century? And is it help us to say, well, the Germans some Germans misunderstood their history and started to believe the myth, and that's what we should take away from it? Or are there other takeaways that, what are we missing in looking at the development of German militarism in World War I and World War II if we don't look at the broad sweep of history before that?
Well, one of the things I think is you miss contingency. You tend to sort of see everything as just sort of inevitably moving towards the 2 world wars, and there's always, again, there's obviously the strong arguments that have been made that the Second World War is programmed in the failure to resolve the tensions that caused the First World War. So there's a sort of general sense of inevitability, and I think that robs the story of human agency. I mean, people also make mistakes, take decisions. All of those things are part of it. So I think trying to restore some of that agency, trying to restore some of that sense of uncertainty. I mean, if we're trying to understand why people did things, they don't know what happens, and they're taking decisions because the situation is uncertain, and we need to sort of remember some of that. And the other thing is, I think if you take that longer view, you have more perspective on what happens. So it does really throw the 2 world wars sharply into focus. The sheer scale of the mobilization, for example, dwarfs everything that has happened before, and it is in these very intense 4, 5, 6 year blocks. So it also gives us some sense of just how momentous those are. But again, when we move forward in time, so after 1945, we see that wasn't the dominant story in the 20th century, and there's all the period that has happened afterwards, which seems uneventful, but there's whatever it is, 5 million Germans, West Germans, who serve in their military across that period, and I can't remember. There's 1.5 million Austrians or more. There's military institutions have this peacetime story too that we tend to forget if we only focus in on the two world wars.
So, Peter, given the fact of human agency, and when you look at the First and Second World Wars, when I study it, I'm just amazed that there aren't more Germans before the war starts saying, "What are you doing? This is insanity." I mean, this is a quote in the book in reference to the Second World War, but I think it applies to the first in some degree. It says, the conviction that Germany was locked in a struggle for national survival before even a shot had been fired. Mm-hmm. And aren't there Germans saying, "Hey, wait a minute, this is," and I guess I'll speak to that. I mean, where does that kind of get derailed? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course there are definitely, and prior to the First World War, that we've got the origins of the modern peace movement and so on. But we've got to, again, obviously, I focused in the book on German-speaking Central Europe, but some of the traits that we can detect there can equally be found in France or Britain or Russia, and this is again something to remember. I think that these things are not necessarily unique to the German mentality, and part of it was the mindset of the professional militaries in the sort of 40 years or so of a relatively long peace, where most of the conflicts had been primarily colonial conflicts. And they're all preparing not for a colonial war, they're preparing for a major war in Europe, and that's their justification. And it's the justification for all their demands on the state for a very large slice of its resources. And they can hardly then say, when the July crisis starts in 1914, well, actually, we're not really prepared, and we don't think we can win. So they have to sort of they convince themselves. Some of them in private know that they're not. That won't necessarily be the case. They can't really admit that. They have to say, well, yes, of course we can win, and we can win quickly, which is the thing. Yeah. That really is the mistake. I mean, the unwillingness to tell the. And some of the political leadership, of course, it's not a struggle between civilians and military. A lot of the politicians are military men anyway. They've served at least, so they shared much of that thinking too.
We have a viewer who asked a question, and I'd like to actually spin the question in a different way. But Wally says, well, what is it about the European states that had them in endless wars up until 1945? You've kind of talked about that a lot. So the question, I'd spin it around and say, what is it, aside from the simple shock value of World War II, that has led to another period of 75 years where there hasn't been, up until about a year ago, hasn't been a lot of wars in Central Europe. I mean, that this whole rise of kind of German military, I mean, it's like 75 years from the time that the Germans take Paris in, I guess it's 1870, to the end of World War II. It's about 75 years since the end of World War II. It's a completely different story. Yeah. So why is it a completely different story, and what does that tell you? How does that fit into your bigger story?
Well, I suppose
it's either that, or I'm going to ask you about the specifications of the Tiger tank. So you didn't want to do that one, so you're going to have to do this one.
I mean, obviously, there is no simple answer to that question. I mean, it's a fundamental question, and we got to remember that yes, while Europe might have been at peace, obviously during the Cold War, as it was, there's plenty of conflicts around the globe in which European powers were directly or indirectly involved in. So part of the reason, of course, is the Cold War divide and the fact that everyone knew that a hot war in Europe would, or at least they thought that it would lead immediately or pretty soon to a nuclear confrontation. So there is that which is an inhibitor. But a more interesting thing, I think, is the contrast post 1990. So there was the desire to cash in on the peace dividend and the dramatic scaling back on the size of armed forces and the way in which armed forces became detached, I think, from society, and this sort of which was coupled with a reluctance to risk lives. So if we look at the way in which European countries viewed their involvement, say in Iraq or especially in Afghanistan, and I mean, obviously, any human life is precious, but the number of people who died in those conflicts, at least from the European militaries, is very, very small. But it made a major public impact. We're not used to that, and there is this belief. So, for example, the advances of modern medicine. And the idea that we can save everybody, and so the sort of a lot of the combat medics in Afghanistan were people who were in the reserve, who serve in the health services, and they're used to saving people. And of course, as we can see today with what's going on in Ukraine, large scale casualties cannot be. You can't cope with that with even with modern medicine. But the public willingness to accept those kind of losses has largely evaporated, which I think is an inhibitor on for most European countries anyway. Has been an inhibitor on the desire to launch conflicts.
So, Peter, we wanted to avoid having this whole conversation be about the First and Second World Wars, but I think we should touch on it. And one of the things that I'd like to get your thoughts on is the Germans in both the First World War and the Second World War, obviously much greater in the Second War, they do commit a number of pretty awful atrocities. And I'd like to know, is there something about kind of what drives that, speaking specifically about the Wehrmacht, what drives that? And is there something about the institution that makes that more likely to happen, or how do they play into that? And then maybe tack on to the end of it the idea after the war about the pure Wehrmacht versus everybody else, and how those kind of get linked up together.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we have to handle this sensitively. Again, I mean, it's easy to sort of find simplistic explanations. Right, yeah, sure. So obviously the Wehrmacht was not the Reichswehr. The Reichswehr, the predecessor of the Wehrmacht in sort of the immediate post-First World War, was then in turn not the Kaiserheer. So there is not necessarily a kind of continuity, and there have been arguments that the Germans had developed a particularly sort of brutal way of fighting, which is demonstrated in the suppression of revolts in German Southwest Africa and German East Africa in the sort of 1905 period, and that you can draw a direct line from their use of deliberate starvation, driving people into the desert and so forth, and basically genocidal policies, to what happens then in the 1940s. And some people have also then linked, well, things are pretty bad in Poland, for example, in the First World War too. And I think I wouldn't say that we can identify those kind of lines of continuity. We can see, of course, some continuities, such as the argument of military necessity, sort of trumping legal constraints and so on, a very conservative outlook, sort of a nationalism that isn't very clearly articulated and defined, therefore can be mobilized in different ways. And then when we put that into the situation of Nazi Germany, I mean, it draws on some of these things, but I think it is also a very different situation, because what happens on the Eastern Front was basically planned, whereas what happens in the Eastern Front in the First World War is unplanned and by and large unwanted, whereas the Germans had planned what was essentially a genocidal war once they start fighting the Soviet Union, and a lot of the atrocities have started already in September of 1939. I think by the end of 1939, there's something like 100,000 Polish civilians have basically been murdered, and this is not just about anti-Semitism. It's a deliberate policy to sort of clear the country.
Mm-hmm.
As a historian, I sort of hate it when people ask me about today or the future, because it's so much easier to deal with things that are dead and done. But you might have noticed there's a big war going on in Europe right now. We touched on it, which Germany is finding itself getting more involved in, although, mostly with equipment and supplies at this point. And I wonder if there's anything in your study of history, of warfare, that offers any suggestions of useful ways to look at what's going on now, that might take us kind of beyond the headlines or beyond the latest story, but give us a framework that history can offer us to sort of better understand what's happening and what might happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we take the present situation as, if we look at it visually, which is what most of us are seeing, so we see obviously things like drones, missiles, clearly elements of cyber warfare. So we think it's all very high tech, or we see tanks and fighter jets and so on. So we think, oh, this is a sort of modernized version of the 1940s. But behind both of those is generally the assumption that we're dealing with national forces, and that war is a policy of national sovereign states. And I think that what I would see is, if we look at the longer view of history, the idea that there is the autonomous state that controls its own resources and can wield those resources to project power militarily is historically relatively brief. I think this is something which has coalesced by the sort of middle of the 19th century, 1850s, 1870s, and it was already dissipating from the 1970s, certainly by 1990. And although I don't like the word postmodern, I would say that we are entering into a postmodern world where states don't fight alone. They can only fight with alliances. They actually lack resources. They have to rely on the supply of resources which come from third parties or from allies. Armies are not really national in the sense of the idea of the citizen in arms model. So we can see this with the use of, obviously, of private contractors, which is obviously very present in the present conflict, but was already there in the wars of the previous 20 years or so. So I would say, if we look at pre-modernity, so before the earlier 19th century, we can maybe ask better questions about the present, rather than thinking that somehow the national armed force is Humpty Dumpty. We've got to put it back together again in order to sort of master the situation. Contractors are a problem, and therefore we've got to regulate them or something. And the fact that we could even think that we can do that in this way, in which these organizations operate in a kind of transnational global way, largely beyond the control actually of states to a great extent.
So Peter, I want to actually I want to ask you about this. It's safe to say that there is an incredible fascination with the German military and the German way of war, whether they have one or they don't have one. Tens of thousands of pages are written every year, and it's sort of ironic. The U.S. military, after the war, they hire all these German generals to write these reports, and that we have this idea in our head that the Germans are the ultimate war-making machine. But as you say in the book, I love this quote, Far from representing an ideal model of how to win a modern war, the German experience serves as an exemplar of how to lose catastrophically. So, given their track record, what is the fascination with the German military? How does it come about, and why do we still hang on to this idea?
Yeah, that's again, it's one that I think we can answer partly sort of objectively. I mean, it was very, very difficult to defeat the Germans in both the world wars. They were very, very effective, particularly at the kind of tactical level. They were also innovative in many ways, but it was never enough to achieve victory. But it certainly made them very, very formidable opponents. So the experience of fighting both of those conflicts profoundly impressed their enemies, and indeed foreign observers. So, for example, the Chinese, the Spanish are interested in Germany in the 1920s. Even you'd think, well, they're defeated. Why don't you go and look at the French or the British? No, because the Germans had fought so successfully for such a long time against such formidable odds. We must be able to learn something from them. So there are these sort of objective reasons, and then unfortunately, I think it's also we are drawn in a way to the glamour of some of this. So the uniforms, particularly there's this kind of awful fascination with the kind of Nazi uniforms, and the way in which society was presented itself in this kind of way, so that people tend to dress up as in SS uniforms or something, rather than say those of the Italian or Spanish fascists.
Right. Yeah.
Well, on that note, it's been a fascinating hour over a broad range of history. Peter, we want to thank you so much for joining us. And I want to remind everybody that we were talking to Peter Wilson. His book is Iron and Blood. It's been out in the UK since October, I want to say. It is just recently out in the United States. Terrific review of it in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. And, of course, it's a Daily Telegraph 2022 book of the year. So please, if you're at all interested, do check it out. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Really
There's
appreciate it.
a lot more to unpack there, guys. Yeah. So
thank you very much. Yeah.
All right. Stay well. Chris,
yes.
Next week, we welcome back someone who's been on before.
Who?
Do you remember?
I do. But
Okay.
Should I say?
Yeah.
Okay. Lynn Olson.
Yeah. Good. We have the same answer. Lynn Olson to talk about her new book, Empress of the Nile, the daredevil archaeologist who saved Egypt's ancient temples from destruction. And, Lynn Olson's written all these books about World War II. And here's something really different. But I'm going to give you a hint that the woman at the center of this story also was in the French Resistance and fought the Nazis. And I'll bet somehow that this came out of her research on Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who she talked about last time she was on. But kind of a story of a female Indiana Jones, except she saves temples instead of destroying them, which is what Indiana does.
The movie wouldn't be as exciting.
I know. So but
does she have a whip?
We'll find out. I'll bet she. Well, you know what? Never mind. I'm just. We're just deleting that topic area completely. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Twitter. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Well done.
Buy our brownies. Test drive our cars. Have a drink with us. Whatever. Okay. Enough. Right. Thanks everybody for coming today. Check us out on all those things and be well.
See you soon. Be safe.